Hello and welcome, everyone. Today we'll be talking about crossdressers and where have they all gone? Because I don't know if others have noticed, but there has been a steady decrease in the crossdressing community. And yet, with this decrease, you would assume that it would be increasing because the world is a little more open minded than it was, say, 30 years ago. So, with this more accepting culture, I don't want to say it's completely accepting, just more accepting, you would assume that it would be going in the opposite direction, no? Now, to clarify, I'm only talking about those that use this term to describe themselves. So, if somebody else is calling somebody a crossdresser, that's not what this is about. This is about me making a video on people that self-identify as crossdressers. Now, if you look at age demographics, especially for femme-presenting people that were AMAB, assigned male at birth, there is a sizable cross-dressing community for people that are like 50, 60, and older. But if you look at people in their 20s and 30s, the cross-dressing community isn't really that big at all in comparison. So this is definitely a generational thing with terminology. Because especially with the youth today, they have so many more resources in regards to gender identity and gender expression that what happens is they are able to find communities that are more likely to fit their needs and be more precise. So while a younger cross-dressing community still exists, it's definitely shrinking because what's happening is it's no longer the melting pot that it once was. It's now people finding places where they're more likely to fit in and feel how they want to feel. Now, when I was a teenager and you were AMAB, assigned male at birth, and you presented femininely, you were one of three things. You were either an androgynous male, a crossdresser, or a trans woman. A lot of the terminology used today that's very important, it just wasn't as accessible if it did exist. So a lot of times, like I was saying, these communities became more like melting pots. And androgynous males weren't really a community per se, but cross-dressing community was much bigger when I was younger, and there was also the trans women community. And these days, there's so many more terms like non-binary and trans feminine that explain people's identities or how they're feeling more accurately. And this is why the cross-dressing community is shrinking, right? It's never going to go away, right? The cross-dressers are always going to exist. But in terms of identity, we're kind of taking away the melting pot and we're having these kind of micro communities because that's what's happening. And I'm not sure the pros and cons of this, right? Like on one end, you have one community that might be really big and all encompassing. And then on the other hand, you have a bunch of smaller, more precise communities. So we're definitely seeing an evolution of language to define these experiences, right? Because let me tell you that if this was 40 years ago, that massive cross-dressing community that used to exist, and maybe people might not have thought of it as massive back then, but I'm using that in comparison to what it is now, right? Those people, a lot of them have a lot of the experiences that trans feminine or non-binary people have. They just didn't have those communities, at least that I'm aware of. So these days, like when I talk to people, even in their 50s or 60s that are cross-dressers, some of them do experience, say, dysphoria, but they don't identify as a trans woman. So that's why like these newer communities are so important, right? So people can more accurately meet people that are experiencing the same things as them and find the support that they need. And I don't think this is going to change anytime soon. I think, if anything, like language is going to keep changing to include more identities, to include more experiences, and to accurately describe them. And I think that's okay. The return end is often you kind of lose one mega community in return for a bunch of smaller ones. And like I said earlier, I don't know if that's like a good thing or a bad thing, because in some senses, you can accomplish more, you can get more information out as like a big group, but you can find more comfort in smaller groups. And there's nothing saying that smaller groups can't come together back into bigger groups, but a lot of times what I find is like when people section off into like their own little groups, they tend to stay there and they'll say they're part of like an umbrella group, but a lot of times they kind of aren't. So I guess like we'll see how this kind of like plays out over the years, but this is something that's going to keep going. And if it makes people happy and comfortable, I'm for it, right? Because that's what life's about, being happy, being comfortable. At least for me, I don't think there's some massive grand plan, right? So that's what it really boils down to, happiness. And on that note, I am out. Thank you for joining me today, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. And until next time, bye.